filter it, and then give it back to the person. The problem with the hemiarch is you can't do that because you cannot cross it. And you can't selectively deliver blood to the body without delivering it back to the heart too. And so what we do is we often cannulate the axillary artery, which is a branch of this artery that comes out to here. Different people do it different ways. I was always taught to find where the deltopectoral groove is, which is basically, if you're as buff as me, you can feel where the pec major is, and then where the delt is, and you make an incision in there. What we do is we then cut through. Traditionally, you try to avoid the pec major, which is a big muscle. You don't want to cut through that, because then people can't move their arm, and it's pretty debilitating. And then you cut down to where the pec minor is. You'll see me, I ask for a right angle, and I divide that. Most people don't need that. It's a little bit morbid. They're a little weaker in their arm, but they'll live. If you can move it out of the way, you move it out of the way. And then usually you find this fat pad. This fat pad has a big nerve that runs through it. You don't want to fuck with that, because that can really mess with things. And then you find the artery that's there. It's a branch of this artery that keeps going out. The subclavian artery becomes the axillary artery. This axillary artery allows us to sew a graft onto that. And what that'll do is allow us to go on bypass. If we sew it on out here, it allows us to go on bypass and deliver blood to the brain and the body through there. Traditionally, we would do it in the ascending aorta, and that does that, right? We would cross clamp underneath it. This allows us to get blood to the body. So we do that. That's the first thing we do. I give a little heparin so it doesn't clot off. I don't give a whole lot of heparin, but I give enough. 5,000 units is usually enough to get an ACT around 200. That's enough to kind of prevent that clotting on. Usually that's an 8mm graft, because you can sew a 10mm graft on, but this artery isn't very big out here in most people. You sew a bigger graft, you have to make a bigger incision, it's just a bigger problem. So an 8mm graft is usually enough to flow anywhere from about 3 to 4 liters, 3 to 5 liters in most people. It depends. It's the flow of the bypass is all determined by how big this artery is and the resistance in the artery. So you do that. You connect them to the aortic cannula to that. Then you make it so you do sternotomy. I make a big sternotomy, bigger than what I usually do with the CABG, because I want to see all the way up here. I usually make it to the sternal notch. Usually I do it just a little bit above the sternal angle of moving. But I make this bigger because I purposely want to see these head vessels up here that we're going to talk about. And so once you make the sternotomy, you open up the pericardium, you do all that stuff we usually do. The goal for this is to get on bypass as soon as possible. And the reason is you want to start cooling the patient down as soon as possible. There's different types of cooling, and we're going to talk about that. Different people use different strategies. There's moderates, antegrade, or moderates, hypothermia, deep hypothermia, and light hypothermia. I use moderate. There's two strategies. There's moderate hypothermia with antegrade cerebral protection, which is the strategy I use most of the time. And then there's deep hypothermia with retrograde cerebral protection. We'll talk about that. But the deal is, most people take about 10 minutes to cool 1 degree. So if you got someone who's at 36 degrees, like us, you got to cool them to 28. That's what? 8? So it's 80 minutes. Cool. And I actually looked at that dissection we did. I had 180-minute bypass time. 80 minutes of that's cooling, 80 minutes of just rewarming, 20 minutes is actually operating. And so it takes a long time to cool. So you want to get on bypass immediately so you can start cooling. We're not there for 8 to 10 hours. Then when I'm doing that, you have to give more heparin to do that, and then you go on bypass, and then you have to start dissecting out these head vessels, namely the left carotid and the right carotid, or innominate artery, right, basically right here. And the reason you have to do this is because you have to set up for the flow to the blood, or to the brain, or antegrade cerebral protection is basically what it's called. And what that, basically back in the day before they had this, what you would do is called clamp and go, which is basically, if you're doing a hemiarch and we didn't have antegrade cerebral protection, you basically just stopped the blood flow to the people. You exsanguinated, took all the blood out of the people, exsanguinated them, cooled them down, and then they had no blood flow anywhere. You just sewed like as fast as you could. Antegrade cerebral protection protects the brain while you're doing this, so it gives you more time to kind of do a better job. And so we cool the people down. I go to 28 degrees, and that significantly reduces the metabolism in the whole body. If you're cold, your body's not using as much energy. If your heart stopped, your heart's not using as much energy. Your brain is not using as much energy. And so it allows you to preserve those organs as long as possible without causing. Because if I do this and they have kidney failure and the gut's dead and their brain's dead, drowning, it helps you get more time to work. So that's why we put people down to 34 degrees with open any bypass, is to reduce the ischemia on the heart. So in these cases, the whole body's going to be ischemic because you're not going to flow anything to it for about 25, 30 minutes. And so it's basically like you're drowning someone and freezing them in a lake. And that's why people are able to be brought back to life, because their organs weren't using as much energy. So same deal. So I pulled to 28 degrees because that's moderate hypothermic arrest. That significantly cuts back the heart, the brain, the kidneys, and the guts use of energy, and thus makes it less anaerobic. And so in this case, my least concern is the heart, which is kind of ironic. My biggest concern is the brain and the kidneys when I do this case. The heart will take care of itself. When you start cooling, the heart slows down. You know, I think yesterday in my case, it stopped at about 34 degrees. And it's fine. The heart's fine. The brain, the kidneys are the problem. They aren't stopping. They can't stop. So they're gonna have problems. So we cool to 28 degrees. I isolate the right carotid artery and the left carotid artery as part of this. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna do what's called circ arrest.